Spirit of the living God, fall fresh on us.
Spirit of the living God, fall fresh on us.
We began this morning's service with the following words: graft in our hearts the love of your name, increase in us true religion, nourish us with all goodness, bring forth in us the fruit of good works. All of our lessons this morning stretch us to prayerfully reflect on what true religion is in our individual lives and in our shared life as a congregation. The Song of Solomon echoes God's goodness in youthful beauty through images of creation. Psalm 45 bestows the beauty of God onto all. In the letter of James, we are told that every act of our generous giving comes from above. The gospel puts all of this goodness to the test. We are cautioned to be doers of the word and not merely hearers who deceive themselves. We are told that the perfect law is the law of liberty. Just in case we don't understand the vague notion of liberty, James continues and tells us that true religion is this: to care for orphans and widows in their distress and to keep oneself unstained by the world. And then the gospel brings it all together. This people honors me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching human precepts as doctrines. You abandon the commandment of God and hold to human tradition. Here at St. Francis, we are very effective in caring for orphans and the widows. We put our beliefs into practice. Our outreach is at an all-time high. Every week we continue, despite some challenges, to offer our neighbors healthy food at low cost through our senior produce market. When this congregation hears of needs, we quickly fill them. Over and above our annual outreach commitments, we gave $1,450 to rebuild the church fund for those churches that were burned down this past summer in the South. But as in every gospel, there's always another message, a message where we can continue to grow in our effectiveness in living the gospel. The letter of James said that in addition to care for orphans and widows in distress, that we should keep ourselves unstained by the world. All of us have to constantly wrestle against being stained by the world. Stain does not always mean sin, but rather the way the gospel this morning suggests that our customs and human traditions might just displace God's emphasis on liberty. In every generation of the church, human traditions slip into our worship and shared ecclesial life, and eventually, and totally unconsciously, present themselves as God's law. We conflate our human traditions with God's traditions to the point we are unable to recognize the differences. One of the core principles of the German and English Reformation was to return the church to God's laws and removing human traditions brought in by various popes and bishops. A 16th century theologian in 1674 said, "There is always much to reform in the church because we are church. We are human beings striving to live into the fullness of God's word, and therefore we are always called to reform." The recurring process of reform, however, never became a core principle in any church, not the least the Anglican churches of the world. We tend far more frequently to associate reform with crises and failure. We reform only after a crisis. There was a crisis in the church during the period of the Reformation, and reform occasionally over the past few centuries reemerges again in terms of crises. The church at local or national level does not have a culture of reform and continuous improvement. So that you have an understanding of what I mean by reform and continuous improvement, I want to share with you another story, a story from my recent experiences prior to coming to St. Francis. One of my favorite roles when I was a trauma chaplain several years ago was the time I spent on the Brain Death Protocol Committee. You heard me right. I said Brain Death Protocol Committee. The Brain Death Protocol Committee met once a month on the third Friday of the month. The meeting was held in the hospital's boardroom in the executive suite offices, indicating the level of significance of this meeting. Attending the meeting every month was the chief nursing officer, the RN in charge of each of the 3 ICUs, 2 chaplains, one being me, the chief resident, the chief medical officer, and a representative of the organization Gift of Life, who managed our organ donation process. Special invites were made to this meeting monthly for those who had been involved the previous month with organ donations. You know, I've been to a lot of meetings in my life as an executive before I was a priest, as a scholar, and as a parish priest. But all of these meetings pale in comparison to the Brain Death Protocol Committee. The meeting began every month with 2 or 3 minutes of celebration. The chief nursing officer and chief resident would celebrate the numbers of organ donations, especially increases over the previous month. They celebrated stories of effective interdisciplinary collaboration that led to better results. Then the meeting would quickly shift, and everybody around the table would talk for the next 2.5 hours about what they could have done to do a better job last month. The brain death protocols were long in place, but not as long as God's protocols. Everybody is familiar with their hospital and church roles. In a perfect world, we fully live into our roles. Hospital roles are like church roles in the ways we are not always as effective as we could be. You and I are effective when we follow God's word with regards to liberty for all. But we get distracted when our customs seep in and take over. Organ donation teams are effective when they follow the hospital protocols and don't get distracted. In brain death protocol, we were not talking about saving lives. We were talking about raising the proportion of eligible organ donor patients becoming successful organ donors. It's not so easy to navigate the dance from eligible organ donor to the realization of organ donation. Every single family is different, with their different fears and resistances that trigger the medical, nursing, chaplaincy, and gift of life teams in very different ways. Every brain death protocol meeting had one purpose: continuous improvement through individual and team reform. How do we become the leading hospital in organ donation? Leading not just in the city, but the region, the state, and the nation. In seeking to be the best organ donation program, everybody on a daily basis and on a monthly basis had to participate in a process of both self and team examination. I was there only 9 months, but in my short time, I saw a great organ donation program become an even better one. What What if we as a church and as a congregation were always asking ourselves the question, are we following the tradition of liberty, or are we getting caught up in our human traditions? Imagine if we were a church in constant reform. But I'm not convinced we bring to reform the same passionate focus as the Brain Death Protocol team. Let's face it, almost everything we do in worship as an Episcopal church, I'm not talking about us here locally, but everything we do as an Episcopal church is based on human custom, except the words of institution, take and eat. These words are Jesus' words. For every congregation in the Episcopal Church, there's a style of worship that matches the particular history of the congregation. Of course, we all follow the prayer book worship, but even following the prayer book, we bring our own customs about reverence, music, when to stand, when to kneel, and when to sit, and when to speak. The only way to see these differences in worship is to be in the habit of going to other Episcopal churches in the same diocese or the larger church. Tom and Sue Wentz always bring me program bulletins from other churches that they visit on their RV trips. One of the joys of my spouse Stephanie's job as canon to the ordinary for the Diocese of California is that every Sunday she visits 2 to 3 churches. By the way, Stephanie will preside on Sunday, September 13th, when Laura Simpkins will preach, and I will assist as needed. When Stephanie has been here, you have seen a very different style of presiding from her than you do from me. I love the way she presides, but I could never replicate her style. Her style reflects who she is as a priest and her relationship with God and the way she encounters God. We all bring ourselves into worship. The risk is when we too quickly associate our desired customs and preferences with what is right, what is perfect, what is necessary, or even what is God's desire. The boundary we can cross that becomes dangerous is when we become self-righteous about the way we do worship versus celebration as a community that follows Jesus into liberty for all. Because worship is very human, we have to, from time to time, review what we are doing and ask ourselves what we do and why we do it. Does the way we stand or kneel at the altar reflect God's desire to bring liberty to the broken? It's important to remember where we begin and where God begins, to avoid idolatry and self-righteous practices that distance us from the orphans and widows God seeks to feed and liberate through you and me every week. The Brain Death Protocol Committee works together to serve those who yearn for life through the gift of an organ. Every successful organ donation the team feels is another chance for a person to live a rewarding life and to give God glory. The Brain Death Protocol Committee deals with real life and death issues, but so do we. The way we worship as a congregation will draw people into healing where they are broken. Every one of us here this morning has a place in our lives that needs God's healing and of words and action. Every visitor every week yearns for healing and in one aspect of his or her life. And sometimes they receive healing, and at other times we leave empty or incomplete. So how does our worship channel God's healing words and action? That is the question. When we are committed to a constant process of reform, then we fearlessly ask, in what way do our customs interfere with God's words and actions? And when do we get in the way of God? The good news is that today's gospel reminds us that we need to reform ourselves always in order to reveal God's liberty to the orphans and widows. And this is my final point. Reform never means that we have failed. Reform never means that we have failed. The Brain Death Protocol Committee celebrated every month, got better and better. They never saw their continuous improvement as a moment of failure, but rather a moment to become more effective in their mission. Reform means we just want to be more effective in what you and I already want to do, to follow Christ in God's love, following the gospel. God bless you.